Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And on the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts, most notably from theathletic.com. He is useful human Arif Hassan. Arif, how you doing tonight?
I'm good. I just got an email, actually, that 4 Minnesota Vikings have been named to the Pro Bowl. So
4 Minnesota Vikings. Which ones have been named?
Looks like it was okay. I closed the email because I'm an idiot. Harrison Smith, Daniil Hunter, Anthony Barr. That's kind of surprising, honestly.
Yeah, more than a little bit.
Yeah, and Adam Thielen.
A little surprised on the Diggs thing?
Yeah, that Diggs didn't get selected. So he only had, how many 100-yard games did he have? So the problem, I'm sure he's like a high-level alternate, but like if you're going to choose between the two from a production standpoint or from like a media standpoint, you'd have to pick Thielen over Diggs, right?
Yeah.
Let's see, he's had 1, 2, 3, 4. So he's had 4 100-yard games, and overall he's got 964 receiving yards in the year. So that's why. But I'm confident he's an alternate. Or
just ends up playing regardless.
Right.
Even if the Vikings end up making the Super Bowl, like, yeah, we're still doing it. For a moment, I actually had just Googled the 2019 Pro Bowl to see where it was going to be at, if it was still in Hawaii or if they were still doing Orlando, or if they just had decided to move it to like MetLife Stadium or something like that. And it's like, yeah, we're doing the Pro Bowl in New York this year. It'll be all sorts of fun. It'll be snow. It'll be great. You thought they weren't playing before? Oh.
They're not even coming here, man.
Yeah. They're not even a chance. They're all just gonna enjoy the 3.5 hour cab rides back to New York. It'll be great.
It'll be great.
Never happened. Never. Still convinced that cab ride didn't actually happen. She's probably still stuck in Manhattan. Darn shame. And welcome to Norse Code. We have a victory over the Dolphins to go over. It was fairly, I want to say fairly decisive, but there were 2 quarters of questionable, which, I mean, it's the Vikings this year. We can expect that. But the Vikings were able to pull it off in pretty convincing fashion on nearly every aspect of the game. So it was kind of nice to see. So we'll be talking about that. We are actually going to be going into a little bit of a Lions preview as well. We already previewed them earlier this year, so we're going to be talking a little bit about kind of what's changed, why are they so terrible right now, that sort of thing. And after watching the last game, boy, that ending was a bit of a heartbreaker. So we'll be talking about the Lions game and going into the mailbag as well. But before we do, just wanted to thank you guys so much for listening, for helping out, for spreading the word about Norse Code. Again, really do appreciate it. We do have a new donation to speak of. A new Patreon subscriber, Christian Cooper. Again, thank you guys so much. Really do appreciate it. It does help keep the lights on. We are ad-free. We'd like to remain ad-free, and we can do that with your support. So if you hear value in what we are providing for you, you can go to patreon.com/NorseCode, or you can go to paypal.me/NorseCode as well and send in a donation. Patreon is obviously a subscription-based service, so you can do any amount of money you would like per month. $1, $3.50 to help keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay. $5, whichever you would like. Which is also to say that before the show, Arif and I were talking, and we found a special gift for a couple of listeners. So we did have to jump on this. Extremely special.
Extraordinary use of show funds that you've provided us.
Yes, so we have special a special gift for a couple of lucky Patreon subscribers. We'll have to figure out exactly how we're going to dole this out, but I promise it will be worth an eyebrow raise if nothing else. Tis the Christmas season, of course. So
right.
So we'll be doing that. I imagine next show that you'll be hearing will actually be one of the Christmas clip shows will be coming out here. So those who are subscribed to Patreon will be getting a second Christmas show as well. But we will be putting out the Christmas clip shows here next week, likely on Christmas Day or the day after. So with all of that said, we can jump into the game. And I think the first thing we have to talk about is the Minnesota Vikings scored touchdowns on their first 3 drives. And this offense did not resemble the offense under John DeFilippo, other than like a couple of plays here and there, but the control of it and the tempo seemed completely different.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, I mean, there's kind of like a lot of aspects about the offense that are worth talking about. Obviously, I'm going to get a piece up on The Athletic. I've basically done all the video work for that piece, so I just have to fill in all the blanks between all the individual videos and write it out. But what I noticed while breaking down the offense is that, so obviously there's this tempo aspect of it. Zimmer mentioned it after the game. And I should acknowledge that Nicholas Olson beat me to the punch on breaking down the offense, the piece over at Vikings Territory. I'll link it in the show notes. And so one of the things that he mentioned, of course, was also this tempo thing about how very often they would let the clock run down and let the defense declare itself and then hard count or get going, or, they'd speed things up and snap the ball right away. They would have silent snaps and stuff like that, and varying the tempo, which is actually something that I found kind of like a fascinating concept ever since Chip Kelly's Oregon offense was kind of part of a discussion, because people always talked about how fast that Oregon offense was and how quickly they'd snap the ball, and they weren't actually the fastest snap-to-snap team. I think that was Baylor. But they were probably the most interesting in terms of tempo, because Kelly didn't believe that sheer tempo was as important as the ability to control, change, and vary tempo, be able to take advantage of that variance of tempo. And so the fact that DeFilippo has kind of incorporated that into the game and has found a way to push defenses kind of off balance in that regard, I think is a really good thing, because I think it's kind of a consistent thing that offenses can do again and again, and to create advantages. I'm not going to say it's going to create the same advantage next year or a couple of weeks down the line as it did in this specific game, which is kind of the first time they did it on a consistent basis. But I think the tempo thing is really great. From a design perspective, I thought they did a really good job keeping things simple. I know that Zimmer kind of wanted to downplay some of the simplicity aspects of it. He did say the offense was a little bit simple. He wanted to downplay it. I know that Cronin wrote a thing over at ESPN that the simplification didn't necessarily mean cutting down on the number of plays, just kind of reducing the formations and personnel from which the plays would be run. But honestly, a lot of the most explosive plays that the Vikings ran all looked very similar. There's a lot of sail concepts in the playbook, which I'll break down in the Athletic piece what exactly that is, or you could just Google it right after the show, whatever works. But essentially, it puts two receivers out to one sideline, one near receiver, one far receiver cutting across the formation, and then one near receiver kind of running straight up. And very often that receiver is running a clear out route, but it tests the zone coverage concept that teams typically employ there. What's interesting is that those sail those sail route concepts very often ended up attacking man coverage instead of zone, but it still worked out. And they kind of repeated that. Two of the three kind of big runs that I broke down were off of duo, which, I mean, the Vikings always have a simple running game, so it's not a huge surprise that they kind of repeated a bunch of the running concepts, because they invariably have to. But, that's kind of interesting. I thought a lot of the concepts were very similar. It was a very simple offense for this week. So I think that played a pretty big role in terms of what Stefanski could do. But yeah.
It was, and Zimmer had even said it afterwards when speaking to the teams, like this, in the first three drives, we scored 3 touchdowns, and that was huge. And I don't know if that was just like a driving point for the confidence of the Vikings, if that was a driving point for the confidence of the fans. But from that point on, even after the pick 6, it felt like this was still a team that could score, that could move, and had no reason to necessarily fear the Dolphins' defense.
Yeah, no, they did a really good job kind of isolating what parts of the Dolphins' defense might be worrisome and negating it, right? So, I mean, obviously you could be worried about Cameron Wake, who, again, isn't going to be always on the field. You could be worried about kind of the run defense potential of Kiko Alonso and Jerome Baker. And, we talked a lot about in the last episode kind of what those linebackers can bring to the game. Xavier Howard, obviously a high-level cornerback, and they still found ways to really obviate what the Dolphins would be able to do defensively, especially, I think, from a pass rush perspective. A lot of that has to do with play action, right? Like, I think was it 36%? Or no, 32%, I want to say, of the dropbacks were play action. That's in contrast to the 18.6% that they had throughout the rest of the year under DiFilippo, which is great. They changed the nature of that play action by having it come from under center instead of shotgun, which is something Sage Rosenfels wrote about over at The Athletic, about something that they needed to do kind of going forward. Zimmer talked about it after the game, after a reporter asked him kind of why did they switch from a lot more shotgun-centric stuff to under center-centric stuff. And he said that it just sells play action better. I was kind of curious about this. I asked someone at Pro Football Focus to see if they could find a way to break it down. And after that discussion that I had with them, it's very difficult to break down because some teams will use under center play action more often. And if those teams happen to be better, right, you're going to get skewed data. And so you have to do kind of team level analysis. It's going to take some time. So we'll probably find out in the offseason kind of what the numbers kind of truly say about under center versus shotgun play action. But, obviously it worked out in this game, and it seems to have a huge effect. The Dolphins were definitely biting on play action a lot, and that helped out in pass protection, of course. So that played a pretty big role. Obviously, the run game, they not only emphasized it, but it was very effective. So we had a listener tweet in, John Foreman, who's a high school football coach, has been super helpful in discussions we've had over the years, that he thought one of the elements of the run game that's changed, and I've emphasized a couple of times that it's very difficult to change the run game because the offensive coordinator is not a run game coordinator very often in the NFL. But one of the elements that changed is very often they found ways to put Brian O'Neill in space instead of base blocking, which happens a lot even on zone runs if you're covered or uncovered. And so that allowed him to kind of be the athlete that he is. But yeah, it was, so obviously, so one of the big discussions to have, right? And I'm just going to kind of preempt. I think we had a couple of questions come in. I'm going to preempt all of them. How much is it the Dolphins defense being bad? How much is it the Vikings defense being good? How much is it kind of just variance, which is something that I kind of talked about before the game and during the game, kind of how difficult it is to break down all of these elements. I think that the only kind of appropriate way to approach it, and maybe the most intellectually honest, is to say it's probably a combination of all three, right? Because the Dolphins defense has been allowing kind of a lot of points to be put on the board. You're probably going to just do better in the game immediately after you fired your offensive coordinator, not because you have a better offensive coordinator, but because the only time you fire someone is usually after one of their worst performances. And so inherently, even if you've got the same quality guy back there calling the plays and stuff like that, it's just going to be better. It's kind of like the same thing as the Madden curse or the Sports Illustrated cover effect. You take someone at the peak of their career, well, you're isolating a moment that they kind of achieved the most, and so they're very likely to regress. And it's kind of the same thing here, is that the offense is very likely to regress forward. And I talked a couple of ways about how other ways the offense would regress kind of forward. One of the ways, of course, is that the kicker's very likely to make more of their kicks, especially one with Dan Bailey's history. That happened in this game. That's very nice. The Vikings, I don't think they fumbled the ball at all, right? In that game?
It didn't count as a fumble, no.
Right. So that helps. And then, so I think that all of that plays a role. But I do think that we ended up seeing a lot of situations where, the Vikings kind of talent won out, and that, that the Vikings kind of schematically found ways to really do a number on the Dolphins. So I think all of these things play a role. I think you don't score 41 points without the Dolphins being a bad defense. You don't score 41 points without, a couple of lucky bounces going your way. Blown coverages, I think, are an example of kind of both of those things combined. When you're lucky enough for a bad defense who's more likely to stumble into a blown coverage, and then you take advantage of it. We saw a couple of those, I think. The second big Tyler Conklin play is a good example. The Diggs touchdown is a really good example. And then field position helps a lot too, right? And so that's when we can have a discussion about special teams. That's when we can have a discussion about what the defense did. I mean, the defense got a turnover it might have been on downs. Whatever. The defense got a turnover pretty close to the red zone, if not in the red zone. That set up another 7 points. So all of that contributes, right? So I think that it's probably fair not to expect 40 points going forward. I don't think anybody is expecting 40 points going forward. So I'm not saying, like, you dummies, it's not that good. But I am saying that, like, probably the Vikings offensive coordinator switch impacted in a pretty big way what happened. But also we should remember the Vikings were playing against a weak defense, and they probably got a little bit lucky in some areas.
Well, the whole offensive coordinator switch usually goes one of two different ways. It never goes in the middle. It either goes really, really well, and all of a sudden it's they had their worst week last week, and all of a sudden they look competent. Or the flip side of that is it looks like somehow even worse, like a team has quit on themselves. So the fact that it went in a positive direction is fantastic. That was all of a sudden we beat a team that was better than 500. I believe they were better than 500.
They were entering the game. They're no longer better than 500. In order for the Vikings to maintain this record, we have to cheer for the Dolphins, which that's not going to be hard to do, but it's not going to be easy, right? Because no one really cares. But yeah, cool. So the Vikings beat a team that entering the game was above 500. If they, win, then they'll end the season above 500, and that's going to be their freaking signature win. Jesus. Wow. Okay. Yeah, I guess pump the brakes a little bit. Cool.
Yeah, just a tad, James. But boy, and Cook was just unleashed out there. 100-yard gain. I believe that was his first one in a really long time. Obviously, he spent most of last year.
Second in his career.
Yeah, I was going to say the first one was would have been that first game against New Orleans, I believe.
Yeah.
So yeah, Cook was running like a man possessed out there, and that one spin move he had. Oh, man.
Beautiful. Gorgeous.
Juked him out of his shoes.
And we can thank David Morgan for that, who had an uncharacteristically bad game returning from injury. So fair enough. But he missed a block there, and Cook didn't matter. Touchdown.
Cook was making that happen.
Yeah. It was gorgeous.
No, that was great. The combo of Thielen and Diggs again got shut down there. This is a third or fourth week in a row that something like this has happened. So you can kind of look at that and go, well, how exactly are they playing this combo, and have they figured out the Vikings offense, even with the switch at coordinator?
Well, it's important to remember. So Diggs got a touchdown at least, right? But he got targeted. I want to say genuinely 6 times. I think he's officially listed as having 7 targets. So there might be a throwaway in there, or I'm just missing one. But Diggs was used kind of a reasonable amount, just kind of not the amount we expect, kind of given the reputation of the duo for soaking up targets. Obviously, Thielen, he ended up with 1 catch in the game on 2 targets.
Yeah.
And then he was also targeted on something that was a free play. So there's also that, but. Yeah, I think that that was interesting, but that was kind of, one of the things I wrote about last week is that, the Dolphins are very likely to defensively do some of the things, which that didn't end up being the case, but they did still kind of shift their focus, do some of the things that Seattle and New England did to try and shut down, Thielen and Diggs, which they, kind of did kind of successfully. So what are the responses? The Vikings have to use their complementary pieces. So they have to use Cook, which in terms of the passing game, they didn't use him all that much. 1 catch, I think, for 27 yards, and that happened pretty early in the game, so they didn't kind of go back to that well. But they ran him a lot, and that's kind of a complementary piece. I'm kind of reminded of the Mike Leach presser where he defined balance not as run-pass balance, but a balance between your 5 skill position players, which is a much more interesting way of looking at it, finding some ways to get all of them the ball. And from that perspective, yeah, absolutely. Obviously, Aldrick Robinson got targeted kind of a decent amount, and so that matters because he ended up getting a touchdown. He ended up getting another, I think, pretty big play. Tyler Conklin ended up, I think, with the most receiving yards on the team from those 2 big plays. And so they really did take advantage of the complementary pieces and how the rest of the offense kind of opens up. And they also were able to use kind of the hyper-focus that teams have on Thielen and Diggs to force defenses to declare their coverage. So one of the plays that I broke down, for example, they have Cook lined up outside the numbers. They've got Conklin lined up outside the numbers. They've got Thielen and Diggs basically in the slot on either side of the formation. And so if you've got, linebackers split out wide, then it's man coverage. But if you've got cornerbacks split out wide, then it's zone coverage. And so they're able to take kind of that, because everyone knows, following Thielen and Diggs, you're always going to put your corners on them. But if you're out in 11 personnel or 12 personnel and you've got, a running back and a tight end on the field, you can have linebackers on the field too. And so kind of where they line up is going to define things. So that kind of helps. And so they were able to take advantage of the fact that teams kind of overcorrect for Thielen and Diggs, which is something that we'd kind of wanted to see more of over the last 2 weeks. And so we saw kind of more, I don't know. I don't want to say the designed shots, because we don't know kind of what the progression always is. But we saw more emphasis on using those complementary pieces, and I think to great effect.
And let's not forget that the offensive line looked competent and had gigantic holes that they would had helped create, so that all of a sudden the running game was going to be useful. If you're going to be up that much, you're not going to be throwing the ball all that much either.
Yeah, that was. I'm curious to see kind of how that progresses moving forward. I find it interesting because in the Miami preview, I was like, oh, hey, the Miami defense. So they're giving up, I think, the most rushing yards, and they're like third in yards per attempt allowed. Is the rushing defense that bad? Because in terms of expected points, they're average. And, obviously I still don't know the answer, right? Because it could just be that the offensive line was like rejuvenated, or they called running plays like, John Foreman said, that uniquely advantaged the offensive line. Or the Dolphins defense is actually that bad, and the Vikings kind of took advantage of some of those matchups. I thought Pat Elflein, for example, was rescued on a couple of those big plays just because of the way the running backs played that. The offensive line, I thought, did a good job, right? Obviously, Cousins was pressured on, I want to say, 7 of his dropbacks. There was not that much contact in the backfield for Dalvin Cook. All of that, I think, kind of helps kind of determine what that offensive line looks like. And for the most part, it looked pretty good. But I do think that a lot of that has to do with kind of the environment that they put that offensive line in to kind of take advantage of the things that they do well. So if that's, duo, when you've got Brian O'Neill lined up directly against a defensive end, which is a concept that, you double team the players in front of you, and then you kind of move up to the second level based on leverage. Or if it's zone, if Brian O'Neill is uncovered, maybe that kind of can help you, run the ball a little bit better. And obviously there were some pretty wide lanes for the running backs to go through. Or, you could be in a situation where from a pass protection standpoint, you're constantly forcing defenders to guess because you've got, really effective play action movement. One of the things I really like about play action that the Vikings used in this game is selling the play action pass by pulling a guard. I know, Andrew Luck said this a while ago, I think on John Gruden's show way back when that was the thing, that if you want to sell play action, you better pull a guard. That's kind of like a football truism, and they applied it here, and it really worked. And that really helps the offensive line protection numbers a lot too, because it's not just the linebackers that are being sucked in; it's the defensive linemen. They even were bold enough on a couple of these plays to just kind of leave a defender unblocked, because that's what you would do on that running play. And so you've got this defender reading the play and correctly moving down the field instead of up at Cousins, who does a pretty good job himself of selling play action. So all of that, I think, did a really good job helping the offensive line. I thought Remmers had a better game than he typically does. Compton could have had a better game. Elflein could have had a better game. I thought Riley Reef had a pretty good game. Brian O'Neill had a pretty good game. He's been very up and down where he's had really good games, really bad games, which is fine. He's a rookie. But that kind of demonstrates some of the benefits, I think, from calling plays with the intention of finding ways to be aggressive while also accounting for the quality of the players that you have.
Well, let's talk about Kirk Cousins, because he seems to be a rather polarizing figure in Vikings Twitter and for Vikings fans. He didn't have a bad game necessarily. He completed a hell of a lot of passes, and I don't know. Did we see the typical overthrow? Oh my God! What the hell was that?
Yeah, so there's a lot less miscommunication, which is nice. That's like a really important part of improving
Yes.
The offense, because that's been a huge problem, especially when the Vikings have tried to find ways to be aggressive. When you miscommunicate, very often it becomes incompletions or more dangerously turnovers. So I don't remember seeing any miscommunication. Despite throwing an interception, Kirk Cousins ends with a passer rating of 112 or something like that because he threw for 10.2 yards per attempt, had those 2 touchdowns. That helps a lot. It's interesting, right? So like you end up with like, it's kind of a Teddy stat line, right? Where you don't have that many yards because you ran the ball a lot, 215 yards, 67% completion rate on only 21 passes or whatever. And so it's like a pretty high yards per attempt, 10.24. You still have that interception, but it's that one was like a really bad interception. But at the end of the day, it's like a pretty good passer rating. But like it doesn't feel like the quarterback did all that much because they weren't asked to do all that much. Plus, he benefited from some blown coverages and stuff like that. And so you kind of have to weigh, what you feel about the stat line versus kind of what he does versus, the game overall. And I'll say that there's not a ton of reason to criticize Kirk, even on the pick 6. I thought, that was more about Minkah Fitzpatrick doing a really good job. I know some people were saying, hey, Kyle Rudolph should have blocked the guy, which I guess I'm a little bit sympathetic because if you block and then the guy breaks your block and then you re-engage the block while the ball is in the air, that's pass interference. And it's interesting because in college it's not, right? Because if it's passed through behind the line of scrimmage, you don't have offensive pass interference. But I think here you do in the NFL. And so you do have to worry about that. But, if you just win your block the first time, it doesn't matter. I still think Fitzpatrick did a really good job. I think it's more about Fitzpatrick doing really well. Did a good job kind of reading the play and hawking on the ball and running it back. But, overall, I thought, Kirk didn't make too many mistakes, which is great. He obviously had some pretty poor ball placement in the second and third quarter, that lull that everyone was talking about, and had some kind of confusing reads. But for the most part, played well and did kind of all the stuff that the offense and the opposing defense kind of enabled him to do. It's very difficult to evaluate him because, again, like he doesn't make that many mistakes, but also his successes were not like given to him, but they were not very difficult for like a typical quarterback to achieve. I mean, like you put an average quarterback in that situation and very likely they end up with a very similar stat line just because you've got kind of these open receivers kind of running free. The throw to Diggs on the back shoulder, that was great. The throw to Conklin the first time was pretty smart recognition of the way that route was designed to attack the corner. And that's good because very typically that's a difficult one to do because it looked like cover 1. They ended up rotating to cover 2. But, that could have been a situation where you've got a corner, you've got a trapping linebacker, something like that kind of lurking underneath. But he still, made the play, and that was great. So it's not like he didn't make good plays, but it just doesn't feel like he wasn't under pressure that much. He had some blown coverages to take advantage of. It just feels like in order to call that performance typical or great, it has to be characteristic of the quarterback kind of going forward. Like if Brady has that game, that there's a very high likelihood that that's just because Belichick and Brady have designed the offense to such a point where those kind of games are imaginable and likely. Whereas if Cousins has that game, it very often just seems like, well, he benefited from some defensive errors. If this continues to be the kind of game he has going forward, then it's much easier to give him credit kind of retroactively for these kinds of games. But for now, because it's not characteristic of who he is or what he's done, even at Washington, it's very difficult to give him credit for some of those easier throws.
One of those things where we kind of have to wait and see. And if the next 2 games end up playing out the way that this one does, maybe he did all of a sudden turn some gigantic corner.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, he might be doing more to like kill plays at the line of scrimmage. He might be doing more to read pre-snap defenses. Maybe the way they're designing the offense tailored to his specific strengths. Maybe, he likes a set of route packages because it's very easy for him to key in on what defenders he needs to key in on. And that makes it easier to kind of read post-snap just because he's more familiar with these concepts or whatever. Like it's very clear that, he had a good game. And it's also very possible that the new synergy between the offensive coordinator and the quarterback might have kind of unleashed the ceiling for Cousins or raised kind of the roof so that he can perform a little bit better because he's in a situation or an environment that's a little bit more tailored to his skill set.
Entirely possible. Let's talk about the defense. Boy, they. I want to say that the Vikings did really well throughout the whole game, but the second and third quarters, just something seemed off.
Yeah. Well, I mean, defensively, they. I don't want to say they got lucky, but they made up for some mistakes in the second and third quarter. Offensively, they couldn't get much going. I don't like the defense. I think over the course of the full game played better than the offense did. That's despite kind of a 41-17 scoreline. Typically, if you see that, you think the offense played better. But obviously, 7 of those points were a result of an offensive pick 6. And a lot of those offensive points were the product of the defense and special teams putting them in really good field position too. So I thought the defense played really phenomenally. Right now I'm engaged in kind of a mild Twitter fight about Anthony Barr, which I find funny because it's like the inverse of the fights I've been having all year about him.
This is just your life now. Go to the last drop.
Yeah. So I mean, for the first half of the season, I'm just like, no, Barr's playing really well. He's playing a lot better than people think. He's made some mistakes, so he's not playing at the level that he did in 2016 or whatever. But he's playing pretty well, and you should all be a lot easier on him because he's not supposed to be covering like receivers downfield or whatever, right? And now he's made the Pro Bowl, and I'm just like, well, I don't know if that was justified. People are like, well, but he's good. Come on, Arif. Come on. Well, didn't you see his last game? Which,
I don't like the phrase recency bias, but I mean, Barr looked great the last 2 games. Did not look good for the most of the season.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I would say for most of the season he looked like an above-average linebacker, and he deserves praise for that, right? Maybe even better than an above-average linebacker, but certainly not like a Pro Bowl linebacker. And then you say, especially this last game, which, I mean, some people are like, didn't you see his last game? And it's like, well, the Pro Bowl voting doesn't take that into account because it's a broken system. Like, most of the votes definitely occurred before that last game, which I agree was fantastic. It's the best game he's had probably in 2 years, right? Like, it was a great game, right? Not just because of the 2 sacks, which were great, but he was also fantastic in run defense. He was also pretty great in coverage. He had a phenomenal game, right? But, that's like one game, and you're right that he had a pretty good game against Green Bay or against the Patriots. But that's 2 games out of 14, I guess, is how we're deciding the Pro Bowl. And he's definitely made some pretty significant mistakes that are his own, right? Like the Todd Gurley one, for example, that touchdown, which we don't want to legislate every single individual play that Barr's been involved in. But like, some of the mistakes, even if they're understandable, a Pro Bowl quality linebacker are less likely to make them, right? So those are all things. But yeah, Barr had a phenomenal game. Kendricks, I thought, had a pretty poor game, but he got that sack in the end, so that helps. Holton Hill had a really good game. Anthony Harris almost had like an all-time game, right, with nearly 2 picks. But he played just pretty well anyway. Yeah, I don't know. It was a good game by a lot of people. Barr is definitely worth mentioning. Hunter is certainly worth mentioning for having a really great game. A lot of stops, 2 sacks, really helped create another sack. And I don't know, there's like 9 sacks, right? He's probably involved in a lot of them. But I noticed in particular his ability to help create 2 of the ones that he didn't get, the stat for. And Mackenzie Alexander had an all-time game as well. Really phenomenal performance by him. Got targeted a lot, allowed, I think, 2 yards in coverage, getting targeted like 7 times or something like that.
Just something absurd.
Yeah, really extraordinary. So that was really good to see because this is the kind of situation where even if the rest of the defense performs well, I think at the first half of the year, it would have been very easy for us to say, well, we have to worry about Mackenzie Alexander, right? Or like what that's going to look like. And, I'm not confident that whoever this matchup is, if it's like Leonte Carew or whatever receivers decide to play for the Dolphins that week, we're not confident in that matchup, right? But he was spectacular in the game, and that's really good. for obviously the obvious reasons that it's good to have good players, but also for the specific reason that it's been a while since the Vikings drafted him, and it's taken a while for him to throw in or show up with those good performances. And he strung a couple of them together over the past couple of weeks.
So the last thing I want to kind of mention before we really like move on is all of a sudden Dan Bailey is super accurate. And someone had credited that to kind of moving maybe a hash mark down or something. I know we go to you for all of your kicker, knowledge and everything, but Dan Bailey, all of a sudden accurate?
I mean, all of a sudden Dan Bailey, right?
Yeah, all of a sudden, oh, that's right, I'm Dan Bailey, I can make these.
Yeah. In my last piece, I mentioned that we have a bunch of examples of players of kickers who have been in the league for a while and then have a down year. I didn't even mention Mason Crosby in that piece. I should have. But Adam Vinatieri, Stephen Gostkowski, Kai Forbath is a pretty good example of kickers who are like the top 10 in the kicker leaderboard in terms of accuracy, which, there's problems with that because field goal percentage is not a great stat. But if you just take a look at those kickers, you generally have a good mix of good kickers and some very modern kickers who have benefited from the overall increases in accuracy. With all of that in mind, and you take a look at all those players, they tend to bounce back within the same year. So kickers who kick at around 70%, which that's what Dan Bailey was doing, I used like favorable endpoints because I was like, what's the worst stretch? Is it 10 games? Okay, I'm going to go the first 10 and the last 10, or the first 6 and the last 10, right? The first 8 and the last 8. So I was able to pick endpoints which complicates the argument, obviously. But I thought, it was good evidence that kickers tend to return to form even in the middle of a year, which is all I was trying to prove. And I think that there's really good evidence that generally demonstrates that kickers can do that. And Dan Bailey is one of those kickers who has a phenomenal track record, I guess the second most accurate kicker of all time in terms of field goal percentage, which that stat. But you would expect him to recover. And he did really well, scoring 11 of the 41 points, 5 of them on extra points. Great, made all of them, which, by the way, I think he's only missed 1 all year. And we've been just kind of harping on extra points a lot. So, I mean, obviously the two of us would because of the friggin' league.
People still try to hate on the league, and I keep trying to say it's the only way to play. The only way anyone should ever play.
Yeah, there's a guy, Adam Harstad, who writes for Football Guys, loves the idea, right? Because Football Guys is a fantasy football website, and he's like, look, if you don't love randomness in fantasy football, don't play it.
Exactly.
Idiots. I don't think he uses the phrase "you idiots," but it's like very clear. He's like, look, you got to enjoy the absurdity sometimes. You got to enjoy the weird quirks that the rules create and stuff like that. And sometimes you can use it.
We are in the championship now in the original Norse Code League. The Norse Code League 2, we both got just trounced. But a win for one of us is a win for both of us, right? Like we're good. Dusty is even included in this little thing. I'm defending Dusty's championship vis-a-vis. I'm defending all of our championship next week when I get trounced. It'll be great.
Yeah. No, we're on pace. Norse Code is on pace to win the league
for the second straight year.
For the second straight year, yeah.
Worst to first. That's me right now. Worst to first. Didn't win a game last year.
Yeah.
Don likes to remind me of that, sadly.
Well, okay, so to anticipate Hoodie's question about do we take our losses collectively, no, obviously not.
No, I've never agreed to that.
Yeah. What happens is when we win, we win. When any of us loses, whoever won, we win. So don't worry about it. So you didn't even go worst to first. You went first to first.
Oh, I suppose you're right.
Yeah, we've got a record to maintain, a legacy.
Just a legacy of excellence at this point.
Yeah, which I'm not saying any of this because the team I control in both leagues happens to have, crapped the bed or anything like that. That would be intellectually dishonest, and we're definitely not that.
No. If anything, we're intellectually too honest.
Yeah, it's it's when they ask you what your biggest weakness is. It's really the thing we think people like. That's actually a weakness. It's in some ways it's a strength, you could say.
This is the worst show we've ever done. Bar none. So let's wrap up the Dolphins game. Is there anything else that we should discuss, or anything else you want to say about the win over the Dolphins?
Props to Marcus Sherrills. I guess he was 3 yards away from a franchise record, which ends up creating the funny effect of, in the game notes they gave us after the game, Marcus Sherrills owns all of our franchise records against the Dolphins, which, like, cool. Instead of all, like, the franchise records.
Is this like Keenum and, like, Tampa Bay? Like, he just owns them, apparently.
Yeah, right, exactly. But yeah, I mean, Sherrills, props to him. Really excellent stuff. One of the best games we've seen from him in a while. And he's been playing really well already, so that's good to see. Great stuff from the special teams unit. Matt Weil is a punter. We mentioned this on the show before. He'll have 2 really great games and another game with 2 really baffling punts. And so it's like a 3-game cycle. We're in the middle of it. Let's enjoy it. That was great. Final notes. One final thing I want to add. There's this thing about Latavius Murray running in 3rd and short that people keep asking me about, or not even asking, just say to comment, not a question. Where they're just like, I hate running Latavius Murray on 3rd and short and 4th and short. I hate it. I can't believe DeFilippo did it. And it's like, well, he has a 50% success rate doing it. It's not that bad. And if you take a look over the last 2 years, Latavius Murray is actually well above average for running backs in converting those situations. And people are like, well, he's got an upright running style, which is like a thing that is true, but is also like I don't want to like knock these people for like caring about football, that they learn a lot about football and learn about the different ways that you can play and how like an upright running style can hurt you and stuff like that. But very often it feels like if you learn kind of a small thing about or a very technical detail about a position, you kind of apply that filter to all of the things that get involved in evaluating that position. And so they talk about Latavius Murray's upright running style. And I agree that it's a concern. If he stopped doing it, he would be a better running back. Great. That doesn't mean he's bad at converting 3rd and short. That means he makes it more difficult for himself than he should. But despite that, he's actually really good at it. And he's been better than most of the league at it for most of his career. And the fact that it didn't work like 2 weeks ago doesn't mean it's a bad idea to run him on 3rd and short. That's a thing that he's good at. So it's fine. But also, like, it's weird because, like, he has a lot of other qualities that make him a very reasonable running back for the Vikings. And an upright running style is only one quality of a running back, right? Like, if an upright running style was the only thing that was worth evaluating about running back mechanics, then Adrian Peterson would just be a bad running back. But he found a way to overcome that, I guess, as he has through a lot of his self-made adversity. But that's not fair. He's had a lot of like genuine diversity that has not been his fault that he's overcome in his life too. But Adrian Peterson joke. Yeah, I mean, he has a lot of really great qualities. Latavius Murray does, that make him a more than reasonable running back for the Vikings. Like, maybe he's not going to fulfill the $5 million a year, whatever. But he's certainly, I think, made the Vikings happy by being on the roster. He's got really great balance, really great approach to contact, pretty good vision, and a surprising amount of agility for a back of his size. And he's not going to play up to his 40-yard dash timed speed, which is a 4.37 at 220 pounds. It's insane. He's not a 4.37 back on the field. That's pretty clear. But he's pretty fast. And more importantly, he's fluid and agile. And people just got to stop bringing this upright running style up. I imagine what happened is that someone brought it up on the broadcast. because it's a true criticism of him, a way that has held him back in terms of his game, especially for the particular parts of his game that the Vikings like to utilize, which is, big pile, short yardage running stuff where that becomes a particular concern. But it's like not the only thing. He's good at his job. So just like stop complaining about it. I just wanted to throw that out there. He had another really great game. I broke down, I think, 11 plays. And one of his runs, which was the touchdown, I think, was one I broke down, and I specifically talk about his flexibility as he approaches contact or changes directions. It's really fluid. So just wanted to get that out there, man. Stop hating Latavius Murray.
Fine, I will. Let's move on from the Dolphins game. Fine, be that way. See if I care. Let's go to the Lions game. This weekend we have the Lions. We are going to Detroit for the game. Well, we personally are, but the Vikings are. So Vikings are going to Detroit to play the Lions, who find themselves out of the playoffs. Not making the playoffs, and in a much different shape than they were when we first met. I guess the first question is, what happened? And secondly, what's different about them?
It's so I hate like using like kind of a narrative and not being able to like point to evidence or whatever. So I'll just say it feels like they've gotten shell shocked since the Vikings game. The pass protection has been worse since then. They were like a top 8 unit, maybe, I think, in pass protection, at least in terms of sack percentage. And they were slightly worse in pressure rate, and so some of the regression caught up. But mostly, they've been giving up a lot more pressure than they usually do. I find it kind of interesting because they've had some players individually play really well over this last final stretch. Kenny Golladay, for example, has played really well over this last final stretch. But, they haven't played up to who they are in terms of their talent, because I think they just kind of know that the front office has given up on the season, which is just like a feeling, I imagine. But yeah, I mean, their offensive line is great at stopping the run, at least in theory. Hasn't been able to generate much push, even though they did actually a pretty decent job at that against the Vikings. The offensive lines looked a lot worse. I think that they've kind of generated a lot of holes in their game, and they haven't taken advantage of the fact that, despite the fact that they traded away Golden Tate, I was going to say lost Golden Tate, but that would make it sound like he got injured or something.
Well, it's not like they gained anything out of the trade.
Right. And especially not this year.
Nope.
But they should still take advantage of the matchups that having a receiver of Kenny Galladay's quality creates, and I feel like they don't work off of that in any way. I think they make him work too much for his own yardage, and then they don't take advantage of kind of the other yardage that they create there. And that's going to make it very easy for the Vikings to match up against them. Just stick Xavier Rhodes on Kenny Golladay. I know a lot of people have been very upset about, or apprehensive, not even necessarily upset, apprehensive about, Xavier Rhodes playing. But, he had a really good game, aside from, one play this last week. And, just let him prove that he's the receiver that he can be, or the defensive back that he can be. And then from there, it feels like they're not getting as much out of, Kerryon Johnson as they were at the first half of the season. And I think it's just because the offensive line just hasn't, played well. And so I think playing from the defensive line kind of out, and kind of orienting your defense kind of around that, maybe supplementing it, of course, with blitzes and stuff like that, doing the same stuff that made those 9 or 10 sacks happen against the Lions last time. And I think they're in a good spot. Obviously, I'm kind of rushing through this, but, we're not going to record a show next week, so we want to get this week, so we want to get the Lions preview out. But I think that offensively, you can pin most of the problems on that offensive line.
It just feels like another wasted year of Matt Stafford. And
yeah, well, I mean, it's a good thing that he's only like 21 years old. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Wait, is he like 34 now? Like, how old is Matt Stafford?
Yeah, I mean, he's still surprisingly young, right? That's like it always catches, but it's like 30, so still younger than you thought.
Younger than you thought. Boy, he's still rocking that backwards hat thing, isn't he? Yeah, it just seems like one of those things where, and we had talked a little bit about this either the last show or the show before, about teams, especially in the NFC North, kind of being, I say stuck, but financially married to this like bad situation. And it's hard to build around a team when you're paying X percent of the cap to your quarterback. And Matt Stafford is going to go down as either the second or third best quarterback in his division the entire time that he played. And it's a darn shame, but like at no point did he ever surpass Rodgers. At no point, like he played at the same time Favre did, and Favre was better than he was at the time. So like, I'd even argue that Cutler was playing better than Stafford for a little while there, and Stafford even has the history of being injured as often as he was in the beginning of his career. So it just seems like one of those things where Stafford, I want to say, deserves better, but it's not like he's a bad quarterback. He's just never been in a situation where his like supporting cast was very good outside of one or two players that he had to chuck the ball down to, Calvin Johnson and occasionally Golden Tate.
Yeah, it is. You'd think a quarterback of Stafford's quality would be able to enjoy at least like one season where he's the best quarterback in the division. It's not going to happen. But, yeah, I mean, it also happens to be that, you know, he didn't get the supporting cast he needed, except the 1 year where Terrell Austin coordinated a really good defense, then fell off, I guess. And that year they also happened to have Ndamukong Suh on the defense. So, yeah, he finally gets a running back that works. He finally gets a pretty decent receiving core, and they just kind of get rid of it for him. Yeah, man. It sucks to Stafford.
I have this theory that he would be an interesting starter if he was to play somewhere else like Arizona. Although then he'd be dealing with Ndamukong Suh twice a year. But, you know, if he ended up like...
he'd be dead in Arizona.
As I remember, oh, yeah, well, the Rams can't play defense anymore. I thought... Well, the Rams can't play offense anymore, at least, but defense is a little bit questionable. And the defense for the Seahawks is a little okay. You know, you send them down to, like, Jacksonville or something. That would be interesting, since Pat Shurmur seems to think that Eli Manning is going to be a starter in the league for the next couple of years.
My God. They committed to him. Perfect timing, right?
Oh,
like
God,
they committed to, they're like, oh, there's a really good chance he could be the 2019 starter. We don't have to worry about this quarterback thing that we royally screwed up.
That we continue to screw up.
And he just he has another one of those games. Like, okay, cool, good job. 2019 quarterback, Eli Manning.
The check engine light's only been on for the last 59,000 miles, but we can probably make it home tonight.
Yeah, exactly. It's fine. It's fine. Well, the check engine light's always on.
That's actually just a feature of this particular team / car.
Right.
Let's go to the mailbag. And the first question that we have for said mailbag is, do you see us running the ball more now that we have David Morgan back? It's from Dom.
I think it's more just about Zimmer getting the coordinator that he wants, / sending an insanely clear message about what he wants on the offense. I think you're going to run the ball more. I think that's it. I think that's what you're going to see. And having David Morgan back or not, I don't think it impacts that. DeFilippo is one of the most pass-happy offensive coordinators in Cleveland. He was very pass-happy even after you adjust for game script here in Minnesota. In a lot of those games, David Morgan was healthy. Even if you take out the Buffalo game, which adjusting for game script already accounts for it, but even if you take out the Buffalo game and only look at games where David Morgan was playing, they still weren't running the ball all that much. So I think that's more offensive coordinator thing. And I think that everyone in the world has gotten a very clear signal that the Vikings intend to run the ball, and so they will. And I think it has very little to do with David Morgan.
Corey Rugg asks, so what do we make of that lull in the offense mid-game? Lack of execution, Dolphins taking risks and winning, or something else?
No, it's the same thing as why they were able to get 3 consecutive touchdown drives. It's just flipped on its head, right? You've got some variance. You've got I think they play those other players too. You've got some execution mistakes, The other side of the ball has an opportunity to make plays, and sometimes they will. And I would say that there's a decent chance that, a new offensive coordinator calling plays for the first time, it has some struggles with in-game adjustments. It's one of the most difficult things, and it's one of the things that we almost never talk about. It's one of the most difficult things for an offensive coordinator to do, especially if they've never called plays before, is especially if you're seeing it from the field level, seeing what the defense is doing and adjusting on the fly to what that should look like. And very often that means having conversations with your receivers and quarterbacks and running backs and offensive linemen, having conversations about what those adjustments are. The next time, we call this play, I want you to do X, Y, or Z. That's very difficult because you not only have to identify the particular defensive look that you're finding, you have to identify what adjustment will work against that look. And then you have to be confident enough to say, hey, based off the field level or based off of the photos that were sent down from up top, that this is something I'm confident enough to do. And then you have to be able to communicate all of that. And there's not a lot of time on the sideline. So that's all stuff that I wouldn't have been surprised at. I'm not surprised. It was difficult to kind of get turned around on. I would say that having a new offensive coordinator who nevertheless scripted a really great, set of drives may have had some difficulties calling plays spontaneously once the scripted period was over, and then also had some difficulties kind of adjusting to what the Dolphins were doing defensively. That all makes sense. It's not something I'm worried about, but I think that plays a role too. You've got a quarterback who's streaky, right? And so he made a bunch of completions, and then he had a couple of incompletions, and those incompletions, turned into punts. And so some of that is just, this is when, Cousins decides to have, a string of incompletions, right? And so that contributes to it too. The Dolphins defense isn't like the worst in the league or anything like that. So they're going to have, some good drives too. So it's all those things kind of coming together that I think contribute to the lull. Even if the Vikings struggle in the second and third quarter against the Lions offensively, and then offensively in the second and third quarter struggle against the Bears, I'm not going to be too worried about whether or not this is a persistent pattern. Because one, the Bears, if you struggle in the second and third quarter, that makes sense. They've got, the best defense in the NFL right now. The other is that you've got like a very small sample of plays from which you can kind of evaluate what an offensive lull would look like, and you have to extricate all of these factors that there is going to be some variance, that there is going to be some a learning curve with the new offensive coordinator. There is going to be maybe adjustments happening faster on the defense than on the offense. Those sorts of things. So that's not something I'm like too worried about. Obviously, in the game, I was, tweeting like, everything's falling off the rails, whatever, right? Which, I wasn't that alarmist, but I was like, maybe let's return to the script. But, I think, big picture view, it's something that's to be expected.
Next question is an important one from Norm Core, who asks, can we beat the Bills yet?
Are the Vikings good enough to beat the Bills? I don't know. Josh Allen's been running like a high-level running back. He's gotten 4 100-yard games now, I think. So it's very Kerryon Johnson-esque. So they've got a really good running game. So you got to have to stop that. Maybe that's tough. Who knows? Bills have 5 wins somehow.
In defiance of God's will, they have somehow 5 wins. Brad asks, is it just me or does it seem like the Vikings never use trick plays? How does our use this year compare to the league, or what about in the Zimmer era?
I don't know that they use them significantly less often. They still use them, right? It kind of depends on what you call a trick play, right? Like those motions and misdirections and stuff, they don't do as much misdirection, but they still, Diggs has run the ball, I want to say 3 of the last 5 or 4 games. That might count as a trick play. Thielen's run the ball once or twice the last couple of weeks. You had the flea flicker earlier in the season. You had some of the interesting zigzag zap motion with Diggs, and then the play building off of that. Against Green Bay, and then I think 2 weeks later. There's like some misdirection, some trick plays. Maybe it's less than the rest of the league. We're not getting like Philly specials and stuff like that. But it's not like the Patriots run that many trick plays. We saw one flea flicker this year. We saw another iteration, I think, of the Philly special from them But, I don't think we saw and I guess we saw a little bit of trickery with Cordell Patterson, but it's not like we saw Julian Edelman throw the ball or anything like that this year, I want to say. So I would say, maybe it's below average, but it's not like so substantially below average in terms of trick play usage that I would say it's all that notable. Yeah, I mean, they've had some trick plays, so cool.
Next question from Big Black, who asks, do you believe that we finally have Harrison's partner in Harris with the way he's playing this year, like I do, and is he still under contract next year?
I think Harris is a free agent, I want to say. But and that's something maybe we could look up during a show that we're pre-recording. But I want to contest first the use of the word finally, because I thought Sendejo has played really well over the past 2 years, especially, this year I thought he was playing at a really high level before he got injured. So I do want to contest that. But I will say Anthony Harris is better. So to that extent, yeah, I agree that the Vikings should stick with him long term. It's one of the easier cap moves to make, and it has to be kind of a cap move because, you're getting rid of a player that can help you. It's just that he's getting paid $4 million a year, so you don't necessarily want to. Oh yeah, so Anthony Harris is a free agent. So okay,
yeah.
But he is an exclusive rights free agent, so it'll be very, very easy to re-sign him. Because he's an undrafted free agent on a 3-year contract. So you don't even have to really tender him. You just offer him the exclusive rights free agent contract. I think that he's the starting safety next year. And I think that he'll be an improvement at the starting safety spot, despite how much I've defended Andrew Sendejo. I think Anthony Harris is better. And so that's really cool to see.
Next question is from Zen Cubit, who asks, why does Cousins seem to perform better under center than in shotgun? This seems to be the polar opposite to Teddy, who is much more comfortable from shotgun.
I don't know, right? So I thought about this, right? Because his under center numbers all year have actually been better. Not just, he was under center a lot in this game and then he played really well in this game. If you take a look at his splits page on Pro Football Reference, you'll see that he's played a lot better under center than in shotgun. But that is actually, it's really difficult to split that effect from the play action stuff. So that is a really important variable, that you're much more likely to run play action out from under center, and that he's much better in play action than he's not than otherwise. And if you separate those two things, I wouldn't be surprised if the effect disappeared. So I don't have an answer for you yet, but I can say that I think the most likely answer is that you're just much more likely to see play action, and maybe, according to Zimmer, more effective or better play action under center than in shotgun. I wouldn't be surprised if, say, you're on 3rd and 7 and you call an under center play versus a shotgun play, that he would perform better in shotgun in that situation. So that's my theory on it, that there's a confounding variable that's really important to that kind of split. But yeah, with Teddy, it was just like, you wanted him to see the defense, and his footwork was much more comfortable with the shotgun footwork, because that's what he did, I think, 60, 70% of his snaps at Louisville, despite it being kind of a quote-unquote pro-style offense. But yeah, there's a lot of factors that could play a role that have nothing to do with kind of the quarterback being necessarily better at one thing or the other.
Next question is it's actually kind of a two-parter from Raul and Kenneth Allen. First one is Lil B the based god the modern-day Oracle at Delphi?
Yes.
And Kenneth Allen asks, why did Lil B shout out David Morgan of all people?
I have no idea. I did a very cursory amount of research on this, which is to find out if they shared a hometown. They do not.
Well, these things matter.
Right, yeah. I mean, that happens, right? So, like, if they're all from, like, Nacogdoches, Texas, they'd all be, like, friends with Deuce, right? So Clint Dempsey, I think, right? Yeah. So, like, that would make sense, but, like, Lil B's from Berkeley, California, and David Morgan is a Texas dude and went to UTSA.
Yeah.
So like, okay. I have no
obviously
idea.
Happy to get the blessings. Obviously happy to get the blessings.
I mean, that made him healthy, which is great. And then obviously that Lil B's blessings on the Vikings overall faded their victory, which is great. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google Lil B, the based god. That's Lil, because if you're not familiar, probably don't know how to spell the name. Lil B, the based god. Curse, which it's much more persistent in the NBA than it is in the NFL, but clearly it matters in the NFL too. So, I have no idea what the David Morgan connection is. We're probably going to get a tweet or a comment that will explain it to us, and I'll be very happy for that.
Be like the one person who figured out exactly why. Yeah, normally this is more of an NBA thing, but maybe he's just dipping his toes into the additional sports of football. So who knows? He has cursed people before, and it has gone poorly for the people he's cursed.
Yeah, he has something like a 95 or 100% success rate. It's bizarre.
It is very weird, and to be blessed is a very positive thing.
Yeah, he's going to start moving betting lines soon.
Yeah, well, if he hasn't already. Right. Also from Kenneth Allen, how did Conklin play? He was PFF's highest graded offensive player, but I don't really understand why.
He had the two big plays. He held onto the ball after just a brutal hit early on. The thing is, I don't know that he did anything in particular to get open on those plays. I thought it was more a play design thing. He was the best blocking tight end in the game, which is a weird thing to say with David Morgan on the team. But Morgan just had an uncharacteristically poor game, especially on the Cook touchdown. And he didn't play that many snaps, so he couldn't make up for what might just have been a simple mistake. Yeah, I mean, he led the team in receiving yardage. Not that PFF will use kind of raw statistics to say this is they use the grade, but yeah, I don't know, man. He played pretty well considering he was put into positions to succeed, and then he did succeed. So you always want to give someone credit for that. But yeah, I wouldn't say that it was out of control impressive. We're not looking at a Gronklin, right? That's what I think Andy Carlson calls him.
There we go. That's just an odd little nickname, though. Luca, hey, this is for you since you seem to like mayonnaise. Is aioli just glorified mayonnaise?
Okay, yeah, I do like mayonnaise. It's delicious. It cannot be your only seasoning, obviously. Yeah, I mean, aioli kind of is. I'm sure I've offended somebody. But, okay, so what aioli is, so mayonnaise is typically an unseasoned oil, with egg yolks, right? And a little bit of acidity, if that's vinegar, maybe lemon juice. But aioli introduces kind of flavorings. As part of the process, you're supposed to grind up the garlic cloves into it, and then you use olive oil, which is a more flavorful oil. And then you just kind of make it like normal, and you can throw some other things in there, but it's not that different. I agree. Some people will argue that the proportions are different, and that aioli is going to be a little bit more liquid, but I don't think that's inherent. Mayonnaise, the proportions aren't set in stone, so no. But aioli is delicious. It's amazing. So I would recommend it, but it's I recommend a lot of flavor. I like chipotle mayo. I like, the Japanese mayo that you get on Japanese wings and stuff. They love mayo there. I mean, you can get, we've got Korean mayo in our fridge right now with, I think it's a gochujang mayo, which is delicious. But yeah, I mean, they love mayo in Japan for a lot of the dishes, and in Korea for a lot of the dishes. It's a universal thing, and you just mix oil with eggs.
The addition of everything else to the aioli does make it pretty good. I will admit that I do not mind aioli on a couple things, but just the thickness of that mayo is just not for me.
That's a recipe thing, right? So if you don't like Hellmann's, I'm totally fine with that. That doesn't mean you dislike mayo generally.
Not all mayo is trash. No.
Yeah, hashtag not all mayo.
Ted Glover asks, does Matt Patricia look like a laid-off Teamster or a laid-off Ford assembly plant worker? I was thinking GM since they're about to close their plant, but... Wow. Wait, aren't Teamsters... aren't Ford assembly plant workers Teamsters?
I thought so.
They would likely be in the law. They'd likely be in the union.
Yeah, they'd be in the union. So, How much does, so the question to me is, how much does Matt Patricia look like the literal rocket scientist that he is? And I guess not a ton, right? Like, I don't know what your vision of a rocket scientist is. That's entirely subjective. Maybe I'm wrong, according to whoever's listening.
But, I mean, when he shaved his beard, he looked like a Best Buy salesman. I mean...
Yeah, that's right. That's true.
I was tweeting about that all day when that picture came out.
But, yeah, other than that, like... I think the pencil in the ear ruins it. Like, I don't think he could be a stereotypical assembly line worker just because of the pencil in his ear. Like,
substitute teacher, or the overweight. He's the overweight gym teacher.
Oh, I like that. No, he's the gym teacher. There you go. Yeah.
Yeah,
he's the gym teacher with like a PhD. Great.
Yeah, they have him teach social studies just so they can like keep him on. Like,
yeah, and so you can like coach. Yeah.
I mean, my God. You kids are making maps. Yep. Sit up. Sit up.
Sit up.
You guys are making maps today.
Show some respect.
Show some respect. We're going outside today. I know it's cold. I know it's snowing. We're going outside today.
You gotta learn what the land looks like. We're not gonna see any. It's not relevant to. Our unit is on government.
Nonsense.
We're going outside and we're making maps.
We're going outside and we're making maps in the snow. We need to be able to we need to deal with this weather, despite the fact that you're not going to be playing in it. Don from Ohio asks, how hurt was Arif that his Seahawks lost to such an inferior team like the 49ers?
I thought that game was great. Nick Mullins for MVP, dude. That was great. There's a piece at Football Perspective that Nick Mullins is the offensive rookie of the year, and I love it because he was on a practice squad last year. So most of the responses to the piece are not like substantive arguments about, actually I think this offensive rookie is playing better. It's just like he's not a friggin' rookie. Which is like the least interesting part of the question to me.
I mean, like, if we're gonna do like get right down to brass tacks here, fine. But this is what he's doing.
Right, yeah. Kyle Shanahan's a wizard. That's a pretty good segue to one of our later questions. Kyle Shanahan's a wizard, and Nick Mullins is his avatar.
God, there's a mental image there. We already answered the thing from Don from Ohio about, but I just wanted to read this. Dear cheaters, since you invoke the whole when one wins, we all win rule in the Norse Code Fantasy Football League, then it also applies to losses. Therefore, since I stomped a mud hole into a reef on Sunday, and James will literally cheat, I don't literally cheat, his way to the title, and since you guys all share wins and losses, then as a parent, I become the winner of the Norse Code Fantasy Football League. I will take the winner's money in Bitcoins. There's no money here. There's only shame. There is only shame. And the knowledge that you played a fantasy league in which you are penalized negative 25 points for a missed extra point, which is the only way anyone should ever play. I'm convinced.
There's very little shame in like losing to an extra point miss.
There's a hell of a lot of frustration.
Yeah,
This is as close to being a real NFL team as you can get on the whole, like, living and dying by your kicker. If I would have lost this week if their kicker would have hit a field goal, like I won by 2 points. So we were and the fact that Christian McCaffrey was doing so well at the very end of that game. Like in that, like on that comeback thing, who was sweating out that one when every pass was going his way? Yeah. So when they ended up missing it on fourth down, I had a nice little sigh of relief. I was like, oh, good, because all of a sudden Drew Brees just forgot how to throw touchdown passes. Here's Arif's favorite question of the year. Luke Braun asks, what D&D class would you assign to different Vikings players? Example, Linval Joseph is a barbarian. Which 4 players would make the ideal adventuring party? So we got a short list here of players, but let's start off with Adam Thielen. I'll let you answer these.
Right, yeah. Shocker.
I accidentally got into a D&D conversation on Twitter the other day and just bounced right out of it. He was like, "Nope, I'm not. That was a lifetime ago. I'm not getting back into this." I made some comment about reflex saves, and all of a sudden I got like 6 tweets. I was like, "No, no, 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 no. I'm out." So, Arif, please embrace this and go nuts. What is Adam Thielen?
That's so okay. So I think all the defensive linemen are barbarians. They have really high hit points and stuff like that. So that's fine with the Linval Joseph thing. The Adam Thielen stuff, I thought, oh, hey, maybe he's a rogue, right? Because he's quick and rogues are supposed to be agile. And there's like subclasses in different D&Ds or whatever, so he could be like a thief or whatever. But I think if he's a rogue, he is a combat-focused rogue, which would make him very likely like an assassin. And I thought that was a really good fit, but then we have Stefan Diggs on the list, and he's between the two of them, he's obviously the assassin. I've got way too much enthusiasm for this.
Embrace it. Go.
Yeah. So to answer the Adam Thielen one, I'm going to answer the Diggs one first. So he's an assassin. I think that makes a ton of sense. An agility-based build that does a lot of damage, scores offensive points, gets a bunch of touchdowns. He's a great red zone threat despite his size. So Diggs is an assassin. So then I think for Thielen, you may have to end up going, I think, not in that direction. You might have to make him a generic class like fighter. And he does a lot of stuff really well. He can apparently take a lot of hits. He does a lot of damage. So he's not like a tank-based fighter build because he's not, going to absorb all of the blows. But he does do a fair amount of damage. So I think he's a standard fighter, but that doesn't mean he's like a bad character or anything like that. Your fighter can be kind of one of the most valuable players on your team. So I would say Adam Thielen's a fighter and Stefan Diggs is an assassin. And I'll keep Linval Joseph a barbarian. They have the most hit points, and duh. That one makes a ton of sense.
All right, let's go to the next one with Cousins.
This one was tough. We got a follow-up, I think, from Luke, who said that Cousins is likely to be a cleric, and I get it, but there are damage-based cleric builds that, they, wield a mace or a Morning Star or whatever, and they hit you with, a club that they can do a decent amount of damage and can wear armor and stuff like that. And so I didn't love that. And then I thought, what's kind of like a cleric and weird? Druids are weird. They're like the hippie vegans of the D&D world. And you can have a healing-based druid class. And so I would say that because Cousins is very interpersonally kind of awkward, and because he has to be a support character because the rest of the party has to be on for him to do his best, I would say he's a druid.
He's a van-driving druid. I think we both agree on Linval. What about Harrison Smith?
He, I think, is the cleric because he does a lot of damage prevention, right, from, just being a safety that's good at his job. I think that you can have an offensive damage-dealing cleric build that's a really good support class character. You can even maybe dual-class Harrison Smith from Cleric Warrior. But, yeah, I think for the most part he's a cleric that does a lot of damage. And from whatever you can specialize your cleric for worshiping particular gods in the D&D universe or particular traits. And he could probably spec into a damage-dealing one. So, yeah, I would say that he's the cleric that can take a decent amount of damage and deal a decent amount of damage.
So the next one, let's do Cook, and then we have our special one at the end. So
yeah,
let's do Cook.
I wish I'd thought about the Cook one more. That one's interesting. Man. So he's probably a ranger, I would think. You can have rangers that specialize in ranged weapons like, arrows and crossbows and stuff. But also, if you remember Lord of the Rings, to make this already as nerdy as it was, actually, that's not any nerdier. Aragorn / Strider is a ranger. And so they have, in the D&D universe, some affinity with nature. But they can also be damage-based builds. They can be camouflage builds. There's a couple of different aspects of a ranger, but you can spec into having a lot of agility, which obviously Cook does, and rangers can kind of supplement a lot of the party while also being really great standalone characters that can do a lot of damage. And so rangers are very versatile, and I think Cook is versatile, and I think he's got a lot of agility, and rangers can kind of specialize in that. So I'll go with ranger.
And this one, as soon as I typed it up, you almost laughed maniacally, like, "Oh, this one will be good." So let's do Marcus Sherrills.
So the answer here is the nerdiest one out of them all. It's so funny to me, if only because it relies on a very specific nerd subculture that I was super into. I blame my brother. There's a book series called Dragonlance, so they've got all the normal like fantasy races. They've got like humans and elves and dwarves and all that. They have a particular race called Kender, which are like halflings. So like halflings are like hobbits in a way, like grumpier hobbits. The Kender are like them, except they're much more childlike, and a little bit shorter. So Marcus Sherrills obviously, and he's short, but they're all rogues. They're all thieves, essentially, and they've got an incredible amount of natural agility, an incredible amount of natural luck, and so I would say that he is a Kender-based thief that has a lot of spryness, agility, luck, surprising amount of charisma, and if he's not in your party, can be really obnoxious. So yeah, Marcus Sherrills, and they're the shortest creatures in the whole friggin' D&D playable character universe aside from like gnomes. Yeah, he's a Dragonlance specific character, which I agree, very nerdy sounding.
Because it is.
Yeah. And specifically, he's a thief. And that's, I think, all defensive backs at some point want to have some thief class skills of some sort. So yeah, I would say that Marcus Sherrills is a Kender-based thief with a ton of agility.
Well, there you go. No reflex saves on any of this, though. So apparently that's
no reflex saves.
Apparently that's too old school for some people. Not that anyone liked it when it was happening. So that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. We will return next week with the clip show, and likely later in the week we will be talking about the aftermath of the Lions game and talking about the upcoming Bears game. So that is going to be it. Arif, what do you have to plug?
Yeah, so by the time most of you will be listening to this, some of you will listen to it right away because you're degenerates. By the time most of you will be listening to this, my piece at The Athletic breaking down what has changed about the offense will be up.
Excellent. Well, that is going to be it for this episode. So again, for Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening. And please remember to tweet that, even if it is a work in progress. Josh Freeman style. And we will see you next week. Merry Christmas. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.